Welcome back to this lecture on aspects of connected speech. So far we've looked at speech rhythm, and now we're going to consider connected speech processes, which include assimilation, coalescence, elision, sandiar, and also a word on juncture. Let's start with assimilation. Sounds belonging to one word can change depending on the environment, depending on neighbouring sounds. Assimilation is when a phoneme is realised differently due to context. Basically what this means is sounds become more similar. This is more likely to be found in rapid, casual speech, so some of the examples I'm going to give you will sound a little bit weird if they're spoken carefully. In English, this usually affects consonants at word boundaries. If we look in the diagram at the top of this page, we can see that we've got word boundaries indicated here, and what we have here is a final consonant at the word boundary and then an initial consonant at the beginning of the next word. The final consonant, this one, can change to become more like the initial consonant, this one, of the next word in some way. This is called regressive assimilation because the initial consonant of the first word is having a backwards effect on the final consonant of the last word. If the initial consonant changed to become more like the final consonant, it's called progressive assimilation. This is much less common in English. Consonants can change in three ways. They can change their place of articulation, their manner of articulation, or their voicing. Assimilation of place is the most common. Let's start by looking at assimilation of place. Alveolar consonants are highly susceptible to regressive assimilation, and that's what we're going to be looking at here. At the end of the word that in the phrase that person, we have an alveolar consonant. The next word begins with a bilabial consonant. And what happens is that the bilabial consonant has a backwards effect on the alveolar consonant, so in rapid speech it's not produced as an alveolar consonant, but it's produced with lip closure, and so it's more like a bilabial consonant. So it would be produced, instead of that person, it would be produced as that person, that person, that person. Now I'm saying this relatively quickly, but it's going to sound a little bit weird to start with. Clearly, from a meaning point of view, there is not a P at the end of this word, but from a production point of view, there may be. Something to note about connected speech processes is that they are optional. They don't have to happen, and in careful speech they're much less likely to happen than in rapid speech. Let's look at some of these other examples. In the next phrase we have light blue, so here we have an alveolar consonant followed by a bilabial one again, and we find that the bilabial one has a backwards effect on the consonant. Now this is place of articulation. What we have here is called bilabial assimilation, because the bilabial consonant here is having an effect on the preceding sound. So in both of these examples here, what we have is bilabial assimilation. The next example of assimilation is velar assimilation, because this time the alveolar consonant at the end of the word is affected by the fact that the next word begins with a velar consonant. So we have the backward effect of the velar consonant at the beginning of colour on the alveolar consonant, so it's produced with the back of the tongue already pressing against the velum. Bright colour, bright colour. Now I can say bright colour, it's possible to say bright colour, not impossible at all, but in rapid speech we want to do this as efficiently as possible, and so often we find that we get this kind of assimilation. And we've also got it in quite good, where the velar consonant there is having an effect on the consonant that precedes it, and so it's produced with velar contact. So here we have velar assimilation. So at the top we've got bilabial, and here we've got velar. My handwriting is dreadful, but anyway, we can sort of see what we're talking about. These examples are using a voiceless alveolar plosive at the end. So all of these have voiceless alveolar plosives. So this one, this one, this one, and this one, these are all voiceless alveolars. And it's worth noticing that it is just the place of articulation that changes. This voiceless alveolar consonant here is becoming a bilabial one, but it is not changing its voicing. So we have a bilabial voiceless plosive here. We haven't changed it to a voiced plosive. If we look at examples where we have voiced plosives, we can see again in good boy, for example, that the bilabial consonant here is having a backwards effect and causing this to be produced with lip closure. Good boy, good boy. And in good girl, again, we've got a velar assimilation where the velar sound is having a backwards effect on the preceding consonant. Good girl, good girl. This also happens with alveolar fricative consonants at the ends of words in some instances. Here we've got does, she, and the sh sound is post-alveolar. And so what happens is this has an effect on the preceding fricative sound. So instead of this fricative being produced as alveolar, it's now produced as post-alveolar. So we have a post-alveolar assimilation. Here we've got an alveolar consonant followed by a palatal one. The palatal consonant has an effect on the preceding consonant, so it's produced further back in the oral cavity. So we've also got a kind of post-alveolar or palato-alveolar assimilation. So the types of assimilation we've looked at are bilabial, velar, post-alveolar, palato-alveolar. And again, just notice that the place of articulation has changed, not the voicing. So the voicing has not changed in this. Now this is important, of course, because we need differences in voicing at the ends of words to indicate whether the consonant is voiced or voiceless. I need this T sound here. Oh gosh, there's so much mess around here we can't really see it, but I need this T here to be a T and not to change voicing, because I need the pre-fortis clipping that we get, the effect it has on the preceding vowel. If it wasn't a T, if it changed to a voice sound, it would sound like that person, and that just wouldn't sound like a T anymore. So we have to keep the voicing on this to make sure we're maintaining the contrast between voiced and voiceless consonants at the ends of words. As discussed, it's the length of the vowel that tells us which one it is we've got. Consonants undergoing assimilation have not disappeared. They're still there because they have to be there to have the effect on the preceding sound. Also, we need to note that if one alveolar consonant at the end of a word assimilates, they all will if there's a group of alveolar consonants. So in the phrase don't go, we actually have two alveolar consonants here, and they are likely to assimilate. Both of them are likely to assimilate. So if I said this in rapid speech, it would be don't go, don't go. And the voiceless plosive here is still doing the clipping, so we need it there, it's not disappeared. In this phrase we've got quite a long group. We've got three alveolar consonants at the end of this word, and we find that the bilabial consonant has a backward effect on them, and so they all assimilate, so they all become bilabial. In this instance, because we've got so many consonants, it's really difficult to know whether this P is still here. Shouldn't be, shouldn't be. It doesn't really matter because it's not going to be ambiguous, what I've said. Assimilation of manner is not as noticeable, and it's usually regressive. What we find is that a final plosive may be realised as a fricative or a nasal, and again this happens in rapid speech. It's not usually the case that fricatives or nasals are realised as plosives. So if you have a phrase like that side, we sometimes find that this consonant is affected because it is followed by a fricative. So in very rapid speech I might say, I want to go over to that side. And in good night we very rarely hear the D unless it's spoken very carefully. So good night, good night. Now you could claim there that there was a loss of this consonant. I think it would depend rather how the person had said it. With the word initial dental fricative, we sometimes get progressive assimilation, and this is where the final consonant here has an effect on the next sound. So in the phrase in the, spoken very quickly, it might be produced in a. Instead of saying something like I'm going in the sea, the speaker might say I'm going in the sea, I'm going in the sea. What is possible though is that these consonants are actually produced as dental consonants because of the dental place of articulation, but we wouldn't need to note that if we were doing a broad phonetic transcription. And also in get them, we might find that this sound here has an effect on the next one. So from a manner of articulation point of view, this is now produced as a plosive. But again, it's quite possible that these are actually dental in place of articulation. But again, you wouldn't show that in a broad phonetic transcription. So the kind of transcription we're looking at is this one in your dictation, not this one. Assimilation of voice is only regressive in English, and this is when the final consonant is lenis or voiced and the initial consonant of the next word is fortis or voiceless, and it tends to be phrasal. For example, we have of course, which is very often pronounced of course, with a very strong f sound there, and that's affected by the following sound, which is voiceless. Now we also get this in things like has to. So we don't usually say he has to do something, we usually say he has to do something with a voiceless fricative. Now one question here is the g at the end of g in good girl, is it an allophone of D? Tricky one. Traditionally, phonemes were not supposed to overlap in their allophones, but this restriction isn't seen as quite so important now. So you could say that it was an allophone of D in this environment, but it would have to be recognised that this was happening because of connected speech processes. Coalescence is where an alveolar consonant is followed by a palatal consonant, and that means that we get two consonants being realised as one, being realised as an affricate. So I like to think of this as the Spice Girls of connected speech processes where two become one. If we have a voiceless alveolar plosive and it's followed by a palatal approximant, then that's often realised as a ch. So for example, Tuesday, this is very often realised as Tuesday in this accent. And won't you is very often realised as won't you in this accent. It should be noted that not all accents do this. In American English, for example, this would not be pronounced as Tuesday. It's much more likely to be pronounced as Tuesday, where we lose the y altogether, and that's a process known as yod dropping. So if this was produced Tuesday, then what we have there is called yod dropping. And we have accents of British English that do that as well. Norfolk, for example, is known for people saying bootiful instead of beautiful. Going back to coalescence, if we have a voiced alveolar plosive followed by a palatal consonant, it's produced as j. So instead of dew, we get dew, and instead of would use, we get would use. And we'd write this as a single word. Like we do up here, we write it as a single word. Again, here in American English, we're more likely to get yod dropping. So in American English, it's going to be do more likely than Jew. So just to note that this is also American English. But again, it can vary according to accent type. Elision is where sounds disappear under certain circumstances, and we say that the sound is said to have a zero realization. Now, for example, we can have loss of weak vowel after these fortis plosive consonants. So instead of saying potato, we get potato. Instead of saying tomato, we get tomato. And instead of saying canary, we get canary. We've lost the vowel altogether. We can also have a weak vowel plus one of these consonants becoming syllabic. For example, instead of saying tonight, we get night. Instead of saying police, we get police. And instead of saying correct, we get correct. Most commonly, though, we're looking at elision of T or D, so alveolar plosive elision. And this is in order to avoid complex clusters. Alveolar consonants T and D tend to disappear in consonant clusters. So let's have a look at some examples. In this one, we've got last term, and we're focusing on this bit here. We've got quite a big group of consonants here, and we want to see what goes on here. So in rapid speech, I'm much less likely to say this T. Last term. Last term. What did you do last term? Oh, we studied this. Now, this again, these are optional processes, so I can say, what did you do last term? But it sounds quite careful to do that. Also, in a word like scripts, I can say scripts, so I've lost the T. And in a word like handbag, where I'm looking at this group of sounds here, I'm likely to lose my D. And in fact, I'm going to get some bilabial assimilation going on there as well. So we've got handbag instead of handbag. You may know in The Importance of Being Earnest, Lady Bracknell says, a handbag, and she pronounces it very carefully like that. But actually, when you're talking about the thing that's got your purse in it, you usually just talk about your handbag. Now, this does mean that we've ended up with a loss of contrast. Are we talking here about a bag for ham, or are we talking about the thing that ladies keep their bits and bobs in? Of course, we can work out from context which one it is. Where does this happen then? It usually takes place where an alveolar consonant is the second one and is the same voicing as the preceding consonant. Let's go back and have a look in a bit more detail at these examples then. So I'm going to just take this off here so that we can have a bit more of a look at what's going on. What we've got in last term is a group of 3 consonants. We've got a s, a t, and another t. The t sound is in the middle, so it's the second consonant here, 1, 2, 3, and it's preceded by a consonant which has the same voicing, so both of these are voiceless. Remember, we need this in order to have a shortened vowel, in order for pre-fortis clipping to take place. So if this consonant was not voiceless, if it was voiced, I would need to hang on to the T because it would be doing the clipping job, but here it's not. As these 2 consonants here have the same voice, I can get rid of the T, and I end up with last term where the T is missing, so the T would go in that position there. It's the same thing for scripts. I have my group of consonants, 1, 2, and 3. The T is the second one, so it's right in the middle there, and it agrees in voicing with the preceding sound. And in handbag, I've got 1, 2, 3 consonants. The D is the second one. It agrees in voicing with the N, and so I can lose this D. I don't need the D to do clipping, and so it doesn't matter whether I lose it or not. So that's where that can take place. The alveolar consonant is the second one, and it has the same voicing as the preceding consonant. That's the rule. If we have very, very complex clusters, they're also likely to be modified in rapid speech. Here's an example, and I'm looking at this group here. George the Sixth it's actually very, very difficult to say this. I need the consonants at the beginning of this word because consonants that occur at the beginnings of words are very important for lexical retrieval, so I can't lose any of these here, but I've got this big group of 4 consonants here. I can get rid of some of them, and in rapid speech what we would find is that we'd actually lose this th and which one of these s's? Well, we lose one of them. I'm going to say we're going to lose that because we want to keep this one, which is telling us it's possessive. So it's the throne belonging to George VI. But you could argue either way. So what this means is that when we say George VI's throne, we actually end up saying George VI's throne. George VI's throne, which is much easier to say. And I've actually done some research which proves that we are unlikely to say more than 3 consonants in a cluster at the ends of words anyway. Moving on to linking or liaison or sandy R, there are 2 kinds of linking involving R. One of them is linking R and the other one is intrusive R. In linking R, where there is an R in the spelling at the end of a word and the next word begins with a vowel, I'm going to produce the R, or I can produce the R. Remember, these are optional processes. So in here and now, I've got an R at the end of the spelling, and if I say the word here on its own in this particular accent, I don't say the R. If I was American, I would say it because there's an R in the spelling. However, if the word is followed by a word beginning with a vowel, which is what we've got here, then I'm likely to say the R sound here and now, and it's a kind of linking thing. Also, we've got the same thing going on in her overcoat. I'm likely to say the R because the next word begins with a vowel sound. So that's linking R. Intrusive R we get where there is a non-close vowel at the end of a word and the next word begins with a vowel sound. Now this is something that would never happen in American English because if there's no R in the spelling, you just don't say it in American English. But if we've got words like China and Japan, I can do it with a glottal stop. I can say China and Japan. I can say China and Japan with a glottal stop. But also I can have an intrusive R in there. No R in the spelling, but I've put it in. China and Japan. China and Japan. Vanilla ice cream is another example. Vanilla ice cream. This sounds really odd to anyone who has a rhotic accent. You just wouldn't do it because there's no R in the spelling. Now, what do I mean by a non-close vowel? Well, this is by analogy with what happens with linking R. If there's an R in the spelling at the end of a word, we are not going to get any vowels that are close or that are closing diphthongs, where the tongue ends high in the mouth. So non-close vowels include schwa, they include R, they include they include any of the centering diphthongs, so ear, air, and ua, not that that one occurs very often, but they don't include things like oo or e or I or o, none of those kinds of things. So they only happen where we have a non-close vowel, and we can see here that in China and vanilla both of these end with a schwa sound, so that's a likely place for me to have an intrusive R, but I don't have to do it. These are optional processes. Finally, a word about juncture. The relationship between one sound and the surrounding sounds is called juncture. Within words, this is known as close juncture. Across word boundaries, it's known as external open juncture. So mostly what we've been looking at when we looked at connected speech processes was what happens across external open juncture boundaries. One way of looking at this is considering what the difference is between the T at the beginning of turn in my turn and at the end of might in my turn. These sound pretty similar, don't they? So in my turn, the T is aspirated because it's word initial. It's at the beginning and I have to aspirate this T here. My turn, my turn. In might earn, I don't have to strongly aspirate it. It's not necessary. And also, something else, I can substitute this one with a glottal stop. So I can say my but I can't do that in this one where it is word initial. Also, in might earn, the I diphthong is shorter because of pre-fortis clipping. It's not much shorter, but it is a little bit shorter. So the position of sounds in words, what they're next to, is going to have an effect on the way that we pronounce them. Thank you very much for watching these videos.